Welcome to the HEARTS Entwined podcast. In this podcast, we'll be having discussions around the secrets which attract lasting, healthy, fulfilling relationships, creating a healthy mindset, and what women should know and understand about men. Introducing your host, Lyn Smith, the Queen of Hearts, relationship expert, trainer, speaker, and best-selling author of the Cupid's Bow technique. Lyn's mission is to have a positive impact in reducing divorce, domestic violence, and suicide.
Welcome to the HEARTS Entwined podcast. This is your host, Lyn Smith, the Queen of Hearts. And today I've got a lovely lady. Her name is Carolyn Hobdey. Welcome, Carolyn.
Welcome, hello. Nice to see you.
Carolyn is my special guest today, and she is actually somebody I'm really grateful for being on this particular podcast, because there's not many people who are prepared to go on record and put their heart on the line and share their relationship experiences for the benefit of others, with a view to sort of the audience members getting some real key messages and gems and insights and fabulous information on the back of that. So I want to say up front, Carolyn, thank you so much for being open and I suppose being in a position where you can feel able to share what you'd like to share.
You're very welcome. I think it's always good for us to share our experiences for the benefit of others. You're right. I think sometimes it takes a bit of courage to do that, but the more of us that do, then the more we have the conversation.
Excellent. All right, Carolyn. I feel that, the key subject, which would be a great subject that we discussed just previously off air in today's episode, would be around, are you a people pleaser? And this is something that I feel that you've got great insights around and especially applied to you in the past.
Yes, absolutely. I think the blueprint for my people pleasing was probably set very early in my life, but it's certainly manifested itself throughout that time in the relationships that I've had, whether those have been, just friendships and relationships, but particularly, most notably and probably in the most toxic way, in the personal relationships I've had with men.
Right. So what's your earliest experience, I suppose, of now that you can, I suppose, in hindsight more, recognise where it all started?
I think that sort of right from the outset, really, I think that even in my first sort of most serious relationship, I think that I had ended up just through some of my experiences in my childhood of being frightened of not being wanted and being left alone and sort of not belonging. I think that's sort of my clearest feeling from my childhood, and I think that then brought itself out in the relationships that I've had, because I think I was sort of desperate to belong with somebody. Mm-hmm. I guess I was always looking for that fairy tale ending.
So what did that look like for you growing up as a child? So people can probably, who are listening to this, maybe resonate with where it all started and what that looked like. I was quite a feisty child. I was very passionate about stuff. And I think that now I can look back and think that some of that sort of feistiness, which I think would have been defined by probably my parents in particular as sort of being a bit difficult, was more about, I think I really was very frustrated at not being able to articulate how it was that I felt. I don't think I had the language to really articulate the deep feelings that I had and the deep emotions I had. I was very passionate about stuff, but I think quite often then that would bring itself out in sort of being a bit fiery. I was never like naughty in the sense of being in trouble at school. At school I would say I was probably sort of model student, but I could be a bit fiery, particularly at home. Right. And were you an only child, or were you in a situation where you got other siblings around you as well?
No, I had an older sister who I've always had a really great relationship with. She's very different to me. Probably I would describe it, she was a bit more like my parents.
Okay. So, and was that behaviour punished, if you were very feisty, or how did that sort of get dealt with, so to speak? Yeah, I mean, I would get told off, without a doubt. I'm not saying that my parents were sort of massive disciplinarians in that sense. They weren't strict in that way, but it was made sort of clear to me that I needed to be nicer.
And what was your belief around what that meant to you as a child?
That if I wasn't nice, then people wouldn't want to be with me. That I would end up on my own, was how it was described to me.
And what did being nice look like in your mind or in their mind?
I suppose then that was when the people pleasing started, of actually sort of acquiescing to other people and what they wanted. Probably not always communicating what I wanted, but not so much what I wanted, but I think sometimes when things happen that I didn't like, not being able to speak up and say, no, I don't like that. And that was sort of for fear then of people not liking me. Right.
Okay. I can sort of relate, and I think a lot of people can relate to probably having the I want or I don't want or don't like trained out of us as kids, can't we?
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the thing that, like you say, hindsight is an amazing thing, isn't it? That we can look back and sort of see those patterns. But I think what I've really struggled with is to say, no, I don't like that.
Yeah. And certainly for me, I can remember, whenever I said the words I want, my parents repeating back to me, I want, don't get, because it was seen as bad manners.
Yes.
When actually what is quite healthy is to know what you want. Certainly, for me now as an expert in this industry, I do know that it's key for women to be clear about what they want and how they can express that in a way that's received, especially by the guys that they're in a relationship with, that, for the most part, if they're in a healthy relationship, men do want to give you what you want and make you happy.
Yeah, completely. And I think what has always been a really stark contrast for me, again, through the ability to look back, is that I've been able to speak up much more in a professional context than I ever have in a personal context. So I have not put up with poor behaviours in the workplace, but in a way that in my private life I've completely tolerated.
Okay, so for the benefit of the listeners that obviously are just getting to know Carolyn, what behaviours have you actually tolerated and put up with when you know that you shouldn't have done?
In the personal relationships that I've had, some of those have been very controlling. And, whilst it still to a certain extent sort of sticks a little bit in my throat to sort of utter the words, but relationships that bluntly have been abusive. And even now I sort of find it quite hard to say that, because I think, oh my God, people just go through some terrible stuff and some terrible abuse. Is it legitimate that I use that terminology in relation to the situations I've been in? But I really think it is relevant as a term, and it certainly is what I've been through, particularly emotional abuse.
So how did some of that emotional abuse show up? Because some women might not even realise that they're in abusive relationships, or even attach, like you say, the word abuse to the way they're being treated, but it actually is. So can you give some examples of what those things were and what they look like for you in the context of what you're speaking about?
Yes, I think that it shows up. It shows up in different ways. I think, particularly depending on the person that you're in the relationship with, because I've been in relationships, for example, where the other person has been very anxious and needy. And in those situations, that control and that controlling behavior still gets there, because they're very dependent on you. They suck a lot of life out of you in terms of needing your time, your reassurance, sort of making you feel bad for sort of having a life and having things outside of them. And then on the other side of it, I've been with people who have been much more sort of aggressively controlling. But again, it still manifests itself in that being a drain on your energy, them wanting to know every last bit of sort of where you are and who you're with, and wanting to control that, and certainly sort of stopping you doing that. And I think in particular, the examples would be where if I was going off and doing something, particularly something happy, I'd go away overnight or for a couple of days with my sister, who I don't get to see that often. And I know certainly sort of in my last relationship, there would always be a crisis just at the point when I was going at home that would then mean that I felt terrible for being away. Several times where I would drive to meet my sister and I would cry all the way there because I felt awful for leaving him behind and dealing with whatever situation. But it was only over a longer period of time that I thought, hang on a minute, this is like a pattern. It's like I'm not allowed to go away and have a nice time if it doesn't involve him.
Yeah, I can see that, that happens a lot in relationships, doesn't it? That you suddenly realise there is this repeat pattern going on, and every time you want to plan something that doesn't involve your partner, like you say, that he either consciously or unconsciously manifests this drama to make you feel guilty about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that in my last relationship, I used to belong to a choir that I'd go to every week, and absolutely love it. Great friends that I'm there with. And I realised over a period of time, I think this is when it sort of much more sort of came into sharper focus for me, that I used to realise that driving home from choir every week, that knot in my stomach was there, because I never used to know quite what I was going home to, what sort of attitude and behaviour I was going to get when I walked in through the door. But there was always this disapproval of the fact that I'd not been there all evening and I was sort of coming home late. There would just always be a bit of a terseness about how he spoke to me, a bit of an atmosphere when I walked in. And like I said, that knot in my stomach used to become like a recurring thing every week that, it took me a while to sort of realise that it was there. You used to think, you make excuses, I'm tired, or it's been a long day, or, whatever. But it wasn't. It was the fact that I was waiting for the sort of bad behaviour.
Yeah, because your body usually knows before you acknowledge it normally. You can sort of rationalise, like you say, in your head why you're feeling like you're feeling, but actually your body is actually speaking to you and letting you know with those knots in the stomach what's going on. But quite often we're not listening to it, are we?
Completely. Because I, particularly in that relationship, I spent a long time treading on eggshells, and you become conditioned to it. And sometimes it takes something separate to sort of jolt you out and make you have a look at that. Because for me, I think that knot in my stomach, that constant anxiety, the walking on eggshells, the thinking about what I said before I said it, like thinking too hard about what I said before I said it, worrying about I'm sending a text message, having to really think about what I'm writing so that it didn't spark a reaction. I became conditioned, and I have to say, it was the total benefit of my best friend, who always has the habit of asking me the question I probably least want to be asking of me, but I most need to answer, that would sort of jolt me out of that. And that was, in the sort of latter stages, I suppose, of that relationship, it was having to front into those questions that really made me look at how this was making me feel. And like you say, the wear and tear on me sort of physiologically was quite extreme.
So what was that question, or those questions that you had to face, that sort of jolted you out of it?
There were a couple of questions, a couple of times really. So one of them, she asked me at one point, she said, "Can you see yourself with him forever?" And it was absolutely crucifying me, because he had children who they lived with us like 50% of the time, so I'd become very close to his children and loved them like as if they were my own. And I'm somebody that can't have children, so for me that was a real blessing. And so the idea of like leaving that was almost like unthinkable for me. So that was one of the questions. And the one time she did say so I was talking to her about the rage that I used to experience from him. And again, I think that had almost become sort of normalized in our relationship. But there had been a particularly bad incident, and I was explaining that to my best friend, who, again, we do keep in touch, but I don't talk to her, don't have many opportunities to talk to her, and certainly at that time to talk to her very openly and honestly. And she just said to me, "Has he ever hit you?" And the answer was actually no, but the answer I gave that came just straight out of my mouth was, "No, but I'm waiting."
So you felt that it could be imminent at any moment when he's in that sort of mindset, yeah?
Yeah, and the worst thing is that because it came out of my mouth so easily, I knew that I'd gone through that thought process in my head. I knew that I felt threatened. I knew that the rage was so bad that I could just see it escalating, that the next thing that would happen is that there would be physical contact during that. So, yeah, I think that sort of particularly jolted me and made me think, hang on a minute, this is mad. And also, I'd seen some of that behaviour manifest itself from him towards others. So, yeah, I was waiting.
Okay. So what jolted you, and I suppose for the last time in some respects, to, I suppose, acknowledge that this was actually going on and be really honest with yourself about how it was impacting you and your health, and make the decision to, I suppose, separate or get out of that situation or relationship?
Well, there's the interesting thing, I think, Lyn. He ended the relationship, not me.
Really?
And he ended the relationship because, interestingly, one of the things he screamed in my face after he'd broken up with me is that you've done this because you wouldn't do what I wanted you to do. So obviously totally blamed me for the fact that it happened to me, but clearly because I wouldn't comply to the extent that he wanted me to comply, because there were things in my life that I hadn't given up. I came under a lot of pressure to leave my job. It was a job I loved, I'd been very successful at, and he put me under pressure to leave it. He really wanted me to stay at home and be the parent to his children and do the school run and all of those kind of things. And I'd obviously not given up my job and done that. There were other things in my life that I did, the hobbies that I had that he clearly didn't like and made very difficult for me, but I'd clung on to them and not given them up. But yeah, he ended it because clearly, he wasn't happy with me. So he'd gone out and found my replacement. And as his, one of his ex-partners said to me, he will never let go of one branch until he's firmly got hold of another. So he'd clearly gone out, found my replacement, within 6 weeks, I think, got engaged to her, and put all that in place, and then ended it with me. And I'd stayed because of fear. I'd stayed because we had all the usual sort of financial sort of trappings of being together. I'd stayed because I loved his children, all of those things. So yeah, he actually ended it. So I suppose, to answer your question, that then allowed me to come out and tell people, and so I've told some things to some people, but never the full story to anyone. And it allowed me to then come out and go, look, this is what this has been like. This is what I've been going through. And I was just able to be totally honest about the control, the rage, the just terrible atmosphere, the walking on eggshells, the gaslighting, which was terrible. That sense of it's you're just mad. All of that had been going on, that in my head and in my world. I was allowed to be honest.
And you know what, that's been a blessing for you then in hindsight, because I suppose a lot of women who find themselves in this situation don't realise sometimes how bad it actually is until they're out of it, and then can look back and think, oh my God, did I really put up with all of that?
Yes. very much so. And it's really interesting for me when, you know, I go out and I do tell my story and speak to people that, you know, what's just so sad is that you do meet so many people who have gone through that, you know, and people that are going through that. And hence why I said it's just so important for us to speak up and have these conversations, because, you know, I felt like I was going mad. I was a very successful professional woman, and I would say sort of grounded in my own right. And yet I'm there, you know, I was ashamed, you know, you're embarrassed of thinking like, how the hell have I let this happen to me? And this person sort of take control of my life. And, you know, I think we do have to speak up and go, look, it does happen, and it's okay to talk about it. And it doesn't make you stupid or weak. You know, mostly it just makes you nice and kind. That's what's led you there in the first place. And I think that we've got to stop feeling ashamed for these things that happen in our lives. And also we've got to feel the courage to speak up.
It's interesting because I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and we were talking about online dating and romance scams online, and exactly the same thing come up around the shame. You know, people don't talk about it because they're ashamed of, you know, admitting that they've been so stupid. And
yeah,
so
definitely. So I think it's just really important. You know, for me, it's so much around, you know, and again, thank God it's sort of gaining momentum and conversation time is the whole mental health side of it. Because I think that for me was being the toughest part of the recovery from that, and other relationships that I've had. You know, again, like this has been sort of a pattern. It's manifested itself in very different ways in the relationships I've had, but there's very much been a pattern of, like I said, that people pleasing, the accepting less than I should have accepted, the, you know, allowing myself to be treated and spoken to badly and not speaking up around that. And so much of that is around sort of the embarrassment that you've got yourself into that situation. And I think that, you know, for the sake of all of our mental health, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female going through these things, because, you know, let's face it, women can be, you know, just as nasty as men.
Yes. Absolutely.
In relationships. But I think, you know, that idea of, you know, for our own mental health, you know, we need to speak up and speak out. It's just a proper passion of mine now.
I agree. And, you know, the first thing I work on when I have a woman that's been in this sort of similar situation is, how are you treating yourself, Carolyn? You know, because usually that, you know, our relationships are a reflection of how we're actually treating ourselves, you know, and that's being mindful and aware of any negative self-talk that might be going on, you know. So if you're always beating yourself up or looking at yourself with disapproval or, you know, feeling like you're not enough, then usually what's going to happen is you'll attract a relationship that will reinforce exactly what you're telling yourself and how you're treating yourself. So are you somebody that can sort of, I suppose, see that's probably some of what went on within you?
Absolutely. That not being good enough, not being worthy, always feeling like I had something to prove, always being hard on myself, totally, absolutely me from, you know, throughout my life. And like you say, you sort of attract what you believe, really. And my self-talk and my self-belief was about not being good enough, not being right, my pursuit of perfection all the time, you know, constantly beating myself up for not being right and good enough, you know, and that came across in so many different ways. Like I said, you know, I've been successful in my professional life because I'm constantly striving. You know, I'm well educated because, again, more challenges I would put in front of myself, more striving to prove to myself that I was worthy and good enough and smart enough and all of those things. And that's completely been the case. And again, you know, the blessing that is my best friend, you know, we actually met at work quite a number of years ago, and she kept saying to me, I need you to see what the rest of us see in you. I need you to learn to love yourself. And I say to her, I don't even know what that means, because I think I've been sort of brought up in a way that if I went around going, oh yeah, I'm like really fantastic and I'm really great, I've been told, like, just get back in your box and stop being so arrogant. And I think that that learning to love yourself, and I, like I said, on the back of that last relationship that ended just over a year ago, that's the voyage of discovery I've been on. And it is possible to love yourself. It is possible to learn how to do that and have that realization of, you choose yourself, whether you think you're right and you're good enough. And that doesn't mean that you can't always like seek to improve things, but you love yourself for that improvement. You love yourself for the mistakes that you make, and the opportunity that gives you to learn, and learning to love myself. And I know that sounds really kind of glib and really easy, and it's not been an easy process, but that has been absolutely fundamental, because it's like now you can set out your standard. This is the standard that I treat myself by, and therefore I'm not going to accept anybody else that's not going to live up to that standard. And that's hard. It's hard to maintain that standard, because you meet somebody and you think, oh, I like you, and I think this might go somewhere, and then they sort of show their behaviors, and you have to step away from things that you otherwise probably previously would have stuck with. But now it's about stepping away sooner and earlier and with less damage.
Definitely. I think, the thing is that you've learnt a lot of lessons, and it's not, a case once you start recognizing that you hadn't loved yourself before, and now that, it is a challenge to start looking at yourself in a different way, and learning to love yourself, like you say, isn't an easy process. It's something I can relate to and look back on that wasn't in place, but now is. And like you say, it's not necessarily an easy journey to embark on, but you know what? The quality of our relationships are reflected in how we treat ourselves. And it all starts with you and looking within and seeing the beautiful, lovely, amazing person that you truly are, and knowing that you are enough. You are worthy. You do deserve great, healthy love. And that has to start first and foremost with looking at that you have with yourself, that relationship that you have with yourself.
And I think the thing for me is that, I totally agree. It's what I've noticed through doing that is actually the quality of all of my relationships have improved. So, I have great friends. I would have said I had great relationships with them, but they are even better now that I come at those relationships sort of way more authentically, much more in terms of like, look, I know my value and I know what I bring, and therefore I'm comfortable in the value that I bring. And because I sort of bring that to the table sort of unapologetically, really, those relationships, those friends that I've got, male and female, but all of those friendships have got deeper, because I come at those things now going, look, this is who I am, and I'm okay with that. And I'm not telling you I'm perfect, but actually I'm okay with the imperfections, and I will work on those imperfections. But there's so many great things that I bring, and I just think all of those relationships with my family, more honest with them. I think at work I turn up as a better version of myself. In my friendships, like I said, I just turn up and be me, and all of those things. Then I think people just feel more comfortable around you when you just turn up as you, and therefore you get back way more than you did previously. And that's what I've learned.
Definitely. The thing is that I feel that we're conditioned, by society, by our parents, by our education system sometimes, to put on these masks where, whether it's being a people pleaser, but, we take on board some destructive beliefs that we weren't born with, but we then start, with our own self-talk, ingraining in our minds, which then becomes, like you say, an unhealthy pattern, where you're not feeling worthy enough, you're not feeling good enough, and therefore you're attracting relationships which affirm what you already think about yourself. And then flipping it on its head like you've noticed, and it's really pleasing for me to hear that, that's all changed now, not just, in the quality of some relationships, but all your relationships.
Yeah, I think it's just benefited me in the round. And you're right, we sometimes have to stop and tell ourselves a different story, examine the stories that we tell ourselves, and then carve out some different ones based on a different set of beliefs. And that's really hard, the hardest thing to change. about anybody or about ourselves is our belief systems that's usually deeply ingrained over a long period of time. And I've fundamentally had to re-examine that belief system about myself, and that's why it's taken me the last year of doing that. So hence why I don't say that it's like really easy. You don't just flick a switch and go, oh look, I'll believe something different about myself. It takes work, and it takes mindfulness, for want of a better phrase, in the sense of just looking at those things. And I do that every day. I fill in a gratitude journal every day, and that's just looking at the small things in my world that are good and right and positive. And not that I think I wasn't a negative person before. My glass has always been half full. But I think now I really pay attention to what's that self-talk, what are the good things in my life, what am I telling myself about what's been good today. And I absolutely guarantee that however bad you think your day has been, if you sit down at the end of it and sort of try and examine the things that were good, you definitely always, without fail, find things. And sometimes it's a really small stuff. It's like, you notice some sunlight and how it sort of came through the trees, or, you spoke to somebody in a coffee queue and they were just nice and friendly, or, for me personally, because, people pronounce my name wrong all the time, that you met somebody for the first time and they got your name right. And, it's just the really tiny things that if we start to notice them, they really start to build up into something much bigger, that just brings that positivity that goes, right, there's some good stuff in my life. Let's just keep building on that. Let's keep looking for the positives.
And then that becomes a habit, because what we've done probably previously is got into the habit of looking at the negatives, they all become habits. So you can literally change those habits by making that decision that you're going to start, looking for the positives, like you say, in your day, around what you can be grateful for. So thank you for sharing that. That's a great one.
No worries. And I think it's that thing of, I read something recently that says, just because you've had a bad 5 minutes doesn't mean you've had a bad day. No. And that's one of my other ones as well. Something bad might happen to you. Somebody cuts you up on your way to work. You don't then have to have the mindset that goes, oh my God, this day is going to be rubbish. Somebody just cut you up, and that lasted, a few seconds, a few minutes, whatever that is. But then you can reset yourself and go, no, but I'm going to move forward positively. So that's another one that I try to do.
Yeah. The thing is that, like you say, you can't let one negative incident affect the rest of your day. You can choose to either hang on to that negativity, which is then only going to negatively, massively, badly impact yourself. It's not going to negatively, badly impact anybody else. So why would you choose to do that? But we tend to do so, don't we, once we're when we're not aware of the alternative. And the alternative is to, acknowledge that probably, somebody did cut me up. Temporarily, I can feel, angry about it, or have a few choice words towards that other driver and go off in my head. But then you can let it go. You can choose to actually then let it go and think, well, that's it, it's done. And now
and I think what I consciously try to do is actually turn it into a good thing for them. So if somebody cuts me up, and whatever, is that's quite often, rather than like beat my horn and get angry or any of that kind of stuff, I'll probably just like smile and wave at them and kind of go like, that's okay. So try and turn it into a positive thing that happens in their day, not just in mine.
Yeah. We can always choose to perceive and react differently, can't we, to whatever situation happens. We don't necessarily have to default into any negative behaviours, because that's how we've always done it. So that's how we're going to always do it going forward. Our past doesn't equal our future. Based on new awarenesses, we can make it different and more positive.
Definitely.
So thank you very much, Carolyn, for sharing your story. I really, really do appreciate that. And I think it's going to be invaluable for a lot of our listeners listening to it today. On the strength of maybe some of our audience members wanting to know more about you and dig down a little bit deeper and get in touch, by what means can people connect with you?
They can go to the landing page on my website. So that's www.carolynhobdey.com, and get in touch with me there. So there's a contact form on there if they want to do that. I'm on social media, so you can find me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. It's just at Carolyn Hobdey on all of those. So you can find me in any of those places.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure that information, as always, gets included in our show notes so that if there are any audience members that want to reach out and connect with you, then they're able to do so via just looking in the show notes to do with this particular episode. So thank you once again, Carolyn. It's been fabulous speaking to you, and I really want to commend you for being courageous enough to share what you've shared today, because not everybody does, and I think it's going to be massively valuable to a lot of our listeners listening in today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
And on that note, I want our listeners to always remember that true love starts with opening our hearts. So for today, until next time, that's it. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Hearts Entwined podcast. You can follow Lyn via the Facebook group Two Hearts Entwined, or search Lyn Smith, inspirational speaker, at LinkedIn, or email lyn@hearts-entwined.com. That's LYN@hearts-entwined.com. Remember, true love starts with opening our hearts.